learned since you've gotten to Duality?
Gosh, lots of things. When I joined Duality originally, the premise of just being able to enable organizations to collaborate on sensitive data really gave me a lot of hope in terms of what the power of that data could do for the benefit of mankind in many respects. I know that sounds altruistic, but we'll get into it in a little bit. When you think about data today that's not being leveraged due to the simple fact that it can't be because regulation says it can't be, ethics say it can't be, privacy says it can't be. But when you think about the nature of what some of these data sets are, if you're able to actually combine them, you could actually do some amazing things. And that's the thing that I'm most excited about what we have the opportunity to do here at Duality.
Right, and I understand that we can go into a million different directions with that, right? Data is touching every facet of our lives today, but if you had to think of a few use cases to discuss, where would you go with that?
The first one would be healthcare, without question. The challenge that exists today within healthcare is simply that all of that information has to be protected because it contains very sensitive information about you and me and everybody else's health. The challenge is that it makes it very difficult when that information can't be utilized to do things like fill clinical trials quickly, right? And organization, every day that you don't fill a clinical trial costs incrementally more money. You can't actually develop and identify effective treatments for people with genomic predispositions. It makes it difficult to actually determine the ongoing efficacy of medical devices after they've been approved, although real world evidence is beginning to change that. And I think that one of the last things is that it's actually difficult to determine the effectiveness of treatment measurements across hospital systems, right? So there's lots that can't be done. But if you could actually do those things and do those things more easily, you actually really unlock a lot of things that today can't be taken advantage of. And the good news actually is that there is an increasing awareness by both industry and regulators that there are technologies that are out there that truly preserve the privacy of both the data and the analysis being conducted on that data itself that actually enable you to begin to solve some problems in a very, very different way.
So if privacy were not a concern or a primary concern, what type of collaboration could happen within the healthcare industry?
Gosh, imagine if privacy wasn't a concern. I know it is, but just for the purposes of going on a little journey here, imagine if it wasn't, right? So different departments in the same hospital could actually collaborate to understand comorbidities across individuals more easily. Somebody that was treated for an ulcer and now is dealing with cancer, oftentimes those data sets don't get, even within the same hospital system, organizations don't know that those things are actually taking place. Genomic data could be combined more easily with patient disease registries or electronic health records. Real world data collection could occur more seamlessly, which right now is a challenge because there's lots of data out there, but how you collect it is a concern. And clinical trials could be more easily combined with electronic health records that would drive more accurate real world evidence that would impact treatment regimens. So there's lots that could be done, but we know that privacy you can't deal with this information without preserving privacy.
Do you find that preserving privacy in healthcare is more of an issue in particular markets?
No, I think it's equal, right? Like, I think that the privacy preservation, whether or not you're dealing with genomic data, you're dealing with electronic health records, you're dealing with patient data, all of that needs to be kept confidential and secure. Pharmaceutical companies would love to get access to that data because if they could do so, they would actually be able to improve their pharmacologic recipes. That would dramatically improve treatments for people. So there is an inherent benefit, but there's always the but. But I can't because that data has to remain private.
Right. Well, obviously dealing with the different intricacies of healthcare, patient privacy, and privacy ethics are very complex. How would Duality be able to ensure or enable that collaboration given all of the complexities involved if we can get around or through the privacy issue?
So this is the thing that excites me most about what's evolving in the industry and what Duality can actually provide today. We give organizations the ability to protect the data itself that needs to remain private so it can be used in conjunction with other data sets that also need to remain private. So what this means is that you actually could operate on complex, sensitive data sets and generate results as if the data itself were being computed on in the clear, with the accuracy as if it were being computed on in the clear, but all the while making sure that none of that data is ever in the clear. The data remains encrypted. The analysis remains encrypted. Only the appropriate party is able to see the results of this complex analysis without ever revealing the underlying information contained in either of the data sets. This is where you really begin to unlock the power that I'm referring to, right? Genomic data being combined with forms of clinical data, you can do things that, this is where the changing humanity comes into effect, right? Like, if I'm able to identify that an individual has a genomic predisposition to a form of cancer that they have yet to be diagnosed with now, you can actually create a prophylactic treatment plan that can be given to an individual such that they will never ever actually encounter that disease. Like, this is just mind-blowing as I say it, because organizations, people right now, they may have a disposition to a particular form of disease. There's nothing necessarily that can be done. We always hear the most extreme example is women that are diagnosed with breast cancer end up with giving them, like, voluntarily having a double mastectomy because there is no form of treatment that can be given in advance. What we're seeing now is that things like rare disease, that the concept itself, when I understood what it actually meant, is that rare disease is defined as less than 10% of the population. In the United States, 10% of the population is 36 million people. To me, that doesn't sound like a small percentage of people.
Not at all.
Not at all, right? But the challenge with rare disease, and I had a dear friend of mine that was diagnosed with one of these rare diseases. He was diagnosed with a form of thyroid cancer, of which there are 4. He had the one that was the least researched because it was the most rare. And as a result of that, there was no effective treatment regimen that could actually be applied to him, and he suffered as a result of it. So if there's the ability for, and the reason why that's a problem is all the data for these rare diseases sits within the healthcare systems, but it's distributed. There are thousands of hospitals in the US. So as a result of that rare disease, hospital A may see 500 patients a year, hospital B may see 3,000 patients, and so on and so on. And that data remains in the healthcare system. It actually isn't combined. Hospital A and hospital B and hospital C can't combine that data. But what if they could? Like, what if they actually could? Because that would actually do a number of things. One, it would improve quality of care for the individual patients within the hospital systems themselves, which for my friend would have mattered, right? For all the people that have these rare diseases, that will matter. The other thing that it can do is because you can actually combine these data sets in a way that's privacy preserving, organizations like pharmaceutical companies can actually do research in a cost-effective way. They can't do it today, right? The reason why rare disease is that there's not an economic way for pharmaceutical companies to effectively treat these rare diseases because they're rare, right? They're small compared to diabetes, right, as a for instance. But by being able to combine these data sources, these organizations could actually get a statistically significant data set that would enable them to really improve how it is that they end up solving some problems for what is rare disease, and it may actually make it no longer a rare disease.
Well, we touched upon different aspects of data collaboration in the healthcare industry, but we also spent a lot of time now speaking about genomic data and preventing rare diseases. Would you say that that's the most realistic use case on the horizon right now?
Oh gosh, no, I think that there are many. We're working with an organization right now that actually wants to create genomic sequencing as a service, where you can take genomic data, protect it, take other sensitive data sets from third parties, protect it, combine the data, and perform analysis on it, right? Gosh, I have no idea what's going to come of that, but ultimately every third party that wants to combine their data set with a genomic data set, they have a particular vector into it, and they're trying to solve some real problems.
Okay.
So that happens to be one of them, but I think that there are many.
Well, we spoke a lot about healthcare and about the different data collaborations we can do within specific segments of the healthcare field, right? Within, let's say, the hospital segment or the pharmaceutical segment or even the insurance segment. But how, with Duality, would companies be able to collaborate across the different healthcare segments? Sort of an intersegmental instead of an intrasegmental collaboration.
Healthcare is an exciting area for new data collaborations. Medical data is very sensitive and carefully protected, which is a good thing. The downside is this really prevents a lot of very valuable data collaborations that can be combined and aren't being used effectively. But today, hospitals and medical providers have certain sets of patient data. Pharmacy and drugstores have their own data sets. Insurance companies have their data. I mean, what if we can now use privacy-enhancing technologies to bring all of this data together in a way that preserves patient privacy? I mean, just imagine the insights, the analytics, and the projections that all could be made to anticipate the health outcomes and critical needs of patients and customers. It's an exciting time.
Well, what are some of the other use cases in progress for shared data collaboration that you're licensed to talk about right now?
One of the big ones is this concept of double invoice financing. So in the banking industry, this is a problem where an organization gets a purchase order to make 10,000 widgets, but they don't have the working capital to actually make 10,000 widgets. So they go to a bank and say, hey, will you finance me so I can actually build the 10,000 widgets I get paid and then I pay you back?
Right.
The challenge with that is sometimes nefarious organizations will go out and take the invoice that they've sent to their buyer and say, will you finance this? Will you finance this? Will you finance this? So now, and the most famous of these was the Henley scandal that cost hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars that arguably, if it could have been prevented, should have been prevented. And it ended up leaving some very large, well-established banking institutions to exit the sector entirely. And the reason why this is a challenge is that the process for trade financing, it evolved with the Venetians way back 1400s approximately. It really hasn't evolved much since then. It's still very much a paper-based process today, although we are seeing that there's some very rudimentary ways by which organizations are beginning to try to apply technology to ask some very simple questions. But the simple question is, have you seen this invoice number before? Or have you seen an invoice number that looks like this invoice number before? And if you could ask a network of banks and somebody comes back and says, yeah, I've seen that invoice number before, that tells you only one thing, which is that somebody's attempted to finance that invoice previously. It doesn't indicate whether they have financed the invoice previously. So now what is the bank supposed to do? They can make the binary decision, should I lend or should I not lend? But they're doing it on a supposition at that point in time. What if there's the ability by which they could actually ask more questions of the network so they could actually get some level of response to be like, not only have they attempted to finance that invoice, but they've actually opened up a couple of accounts over the course of the bank, over multiple banks over the course of the last 30 days for greater than $1 million. Okay, well that's probably behavior that I want to flag.
Okay. And speaking about how shared data collaboration can have such an impact in healthcare, how do you see this innovation having such an impact on the finance industry as a whole?
So right now, one of the challenges that, and it's very different in healthcare and banking, just the way that regulators look at it, but one of the challenges with solving this problem is that banks actually are hindered by regulation within their own country. Mm-hmm. I can't ask bank, if I'm a bank, and I'm bank A, I can't ask bank B, do you bank TOVA? Right, because the bank can't answer that question by regulation, right? Cross-border becomes even more challenging due to data residency requirements, whereby if I'm a bank in Timbuktu and you're a bank in East Jabip, I can't ask your bank because the rule says that citizen data in East Jabip can't come from East Jabip to Timbuktu. It's not allowed, right? So how do you solve that problem? And then the last thing is that trade financing relationships are longstanding, and for a bank to ask a question about an organization to another bank, by definition, it has the potential to impact them from a competitive perspective. Their perception is that if I ask a question about TOVA's organization, other banks are going to know that I'm about to finance TOVA's organization, and as a result of that, they're likely going to approach you and try to compete with me, and banks just aren't willing to do that. So all of those things are headwinds against solving this problem today.
So Michael, how does Duality's technology help address these issues with duplicate trade financing and duplicate invoices?
So we can help in a substantive way, right? When you think about the three non-paper-based challenges that we've talked about, which is can't ask questions within country of whether or not their bank relationships exist. You can't ask questions cross-border because of regulatory concerns. And banks generally don't want to reveal anything about who they bank with, right, because of competitive reasons. So what we enable organizations to do is, due to the fact that we are able to protect information, protect the questions that are being asked themselves, we're able to obviate all the issues that these banks are contending with today. So as a for instance, if we, and we're seeing this today, there are banking networks that are beginning to form where they can ask this invoice question, have you seen this invoice number before? And they're doing it in a privacy preserving way in some contexts. However, excuse me, if the answer comes back and says, yes, we've seen that invoice before, the next set of questions are the ones that banks want to be able to ask, that we actually enable them to ask. And we can do so in a way by which, if I have a network of banks, that network will have pre-agreed to the types of questions that can be asked, right? So that means I can ask you question A and you can ask me question B, or question A as well, right? So we've already agreed to that as a format. The thing that we're able to do is, because of the way our technology works, we're able to encrypt the question. So I'm going to ask about Tova, but I'm going to encrypt Tova's name. And because of the fact that it is only the question and the response that ever moves, right? So the data itself never moves. The data about you remains in the bank, whether that's within country or cross-border. And because I'm able to get a response that says, has Tova attempted to open up a bank account for more than $1 million within the last 30 days after I already know that you've attempted to finance invoice 1, 2, 3, 4, what we've been able to ascertain through both legal opinion and regulators on record is that because none of the data about the individual or about the organization actually ever moves, organizations are actually able to use this type of technology in a way that's compliant with regulation. And not only is it compliant with regulation, but we have regulators state that for regulations like GDPR and CCPA is that the questions themselves and the responses are outside of the purview of those regulations because none of the data actually gets transferred. Right? That's a very powerful statement. Most organizations don't recognize that and they have a tough time getting their head around it, but if only the question is asked and that moves, and the response that comes back most oftentimes is a yes, no, like, has Tova opened up an account for more than $1 million in the last 30 days? Yes, great. Now I have enough information to know that I'm not going to finance that particular invoice. Yeah, us and our partners, we actually believe, based on work we're doing with a number of financial services organizations, that this will solve the trade financing problem. This is a multi-billion-dollar problem that industry is grappling with today, and they're just getting their heads around the fact that there are technologies that now can solve that. And when I look at the things that we're trying to do, because just because a bank or two recognizes that this can be done doesn't solve the problem, right? So we're aggressively working to educate the regulators in the industry that, to one, make sure they're aware that this technology exists, to make sure that they understand how the technology works relative to the regulation itself, and ultimately to work then with industry to help them understand that not only can it solve the problem, it's in compliance with regulation. So if you think about the triangle between regulators, legislators, and industry, all of those have to be in the loop, right? Because oftentimes the regulators themselves, they recognize there's a gap in the law. We need to help educate them on the fact that here is the gap, here is the benefit of closing that gap, so they can actually have a conversation with the legislator, right? Because if that gap needs to be filled by law, they need to make the change. Industry is asking the question of the regulators, is this on site? Right? We're working to help educate them to say, yes, it is on site, let's go to the regulators together. We may already have spoken to them. So really it's that confluence of legislation, regulation, and industry that we're really trying to combine our efforts to ensure that they recognize that this technology can solve a very significant problem.
Well, you touched on this issue and then we sort of circled around it. You know, you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. We have this amazing technology that will be able to solve this issue, but I can imagine that there's some issues with getting organizations to buy in, both in terms of changing the status quo, and not just in terms of compliance and regulation, but also ensuring and enabling them to do it in a way that remains competitive for them. How do you say that? What kind of objections would come up during these types of conversations, and how do you counter those using Duality's technology?
The objections that come up is not, it used to be, does this technology work?
Right.
That's no longer the case. And most people recognize the technology works and does so in a privacy preserving way. And not just some of the time, but 100% of the time, right? Like that's the most important thing. Privacy is never compromised. The sensitive data is never exposed. That everyone just needs to recognize that is now fact. So more and more of that is happening. The next level of question comes in and say, does it satisfy my particular use case? We've talked about many of them today, right? Those use cases, the use cases that we've gone through today, this technology solves those problems. And I think then the third piece is just making sure that there's some sort of regulatory blessing that exists such that the question that industry has about can I use this technology and am I going to get in trouble, right? Because that's the second question is, okay, I know that it protects the data. Am I going to get in trouble because is this really on the side of the law? That's the area that actually I think that we have to spend the majority of our time focused on.
It's an exciting time for Duality right now. We're doing a lot of expansive efforts. We're incorporating new use cases and we're really ahead of the curve. What can you reveal to us about what's ahead for Duality and what we're bringing to the table?
Yeah, Duality, the difference about Duality in the privacy enhancing technology space is we're an enterprise software company. What that means is we're able to solve problems for customers from understanding what the problem is, helping work with them to ensure that they have the appropriate policy and governance frameworks in place, getting the data into a format that actually can be utilized, and then actually collaborating on the data, which is ultimately what our technology does. But all of the stuff that has to happen up front to make organizations comfortable with the fact they're dealing with a company that knows how to solve the problem. The problem is not just collaboration, it's all the stuff that has to happen up front. Are they on side with regulation? Do they have the appropriate policy in place? Do they have the appropriate consents workflows to actually use the data? Once they do all that, is there a governance framework that ensures that that data gets used in compliance with everything that we've just talked about, while ensuring that as collaboration is occurring, that we have the ability to manage consent. And consent continues to be an area where, and we're going to see this over the course of the coming months and years, which is consent is going to be temporal, it's going to be very specific for a specific use, it's going to be very specific for a particular data point. You can use my date of birth, right, for this period of time, and after that you can't.
Right.
And ultimately our ability to help solve that problem holistically, and then on the back end to be in a position to actually show reporting that indicates that the data was used in compliance with policy, the data was on side with terms of who's supposed to get access, etc. All of that ultimately is a life cycle that organizations need to get their head around when they're looking at any technology vendor, and I feel that we're very well positioned to ensure that we can solve the holistic problems that our customers are